You've joined us for another episode of No Free Lunch Economics for a Fallen World. We're continuing to have our conversation about macroeconomics and some of its impacts, effects, etc. Dr. Heyman, there's two ways people can think about the economy: demand side or supply side. Unpack that for us.
Sure, and in this chapter, what we started out with was a definition of the gross domestic product, and let me go ahead and build that real quick just to talk about it a little bit. This is the way we typically talk about it in public policy circles, what you'll hear on the press and media. You know, hey, the economy shrunk 30% in the second quarter of 2020 because of the virus. And what they mean is the gross domestic product, that calculation was down by that amount. And we divide that up into four areas really, but the three plus government consumption, plus investment, net exports, and then you have government spending would all be captured. But here's this is the market value of all final goods and services. So that's an important thing to be aware of. This is only on kind of that final sales, and much of our economic activity is in intermediate goods. So if you simply look at GDP growth, you might not be capturing what's happening in the real economy if that's your focus. It's a good statistic for what it does, but it's not. You should not think of GDP as the economy. It's a capturing of the overall value of final sales and goods. And the reason is we don't want to include that intermediate activity because it was already priced into the good earlier in the production process. But at any snapshot in time, there's a lot of intermediate activity that will be in a future GDP, but isn't captured today. So if you're thinking about the economy, you would not think that way. So that leads us to this final sales, starts to think about expenditures, consumption, doesn't think too much about production. And this all gets back in large part because John Maynard Keynes wanted the government to spend and really to stimulate consumption. Even this, the investment good, this is business spending, so that's somewhat productive in the sense that it's going to lead to future production, but it's still not capturing all of the intermediate activity down below. And so if you have the GDP go down, then the views that focus on demand side economics will say, well, hey, if GDP is going down, then the cure could be to make G go up, and that could help. Or it could be, hey, you know, G might not go directly up, but maybe we could give a tax rebate so private individuals would spend more and consumption would go up. There are lots of different ways, but all of it focused on what we would call fiscal policy, the government spending and taxing decisions to affect some aspect of consumption or investment generally, only occasionally maybe net exports, or sometimes even government spending directly to cause GDP growth to increase. So this would be a demand side focus on the economy. Typically, if the idea would be if the economy's slack, then you ought to cut taxes or increase government spending. If the economy is smoking hot, then maybe you ought to raise taxes or curtail government spending. The problem is they always do the former, they never do the latter. They never raise taxes when the economy is smoking. They say, let these profits run, let's just go. But that's contrasted with another way of looking at the economy, and you can think about that from the supply side. The economy, you would similarly see that would we could call it the aggregate supply the way I've got it here, but that's also going to be equal to the value of GDP. But everything that's consumed that comes into CI, NX, and G was produced at an earlier time. And so we had the production function earlier on in the book, and we've got a little bit more robust one. It's not necessarily exactly this, but it gives you a good representation. We can think of aggregate supply, or the value of output, GDP, as being where we've got this technological knowledge, the best way to use resources, and it's a function of how much labor, how much capital, how much human capital, how many natural resources do you have. That leads to a little bit different focus though. If GDP is slower, maybe what you do is work to increase this. How could you do that? I'm glad you asked, Dr. Guernsey. Supply side focus economists might say, well, we need to instead think about the incentives that people have to work, to save, to invest, to innovate. All of those things might be able to cause Y to increase. Now, here's the problem. Pretty much all economists acknowledge demand side things, and pretty much all economists would acknowledge supply side considerations. But supply side considerations tend to take a lot longer to take effect. If you lower taxes, you can have some consumption effects immediately as people have more spending cash. But to have the changes in incentive to lead to changes in behavior, to lead to a lot higher output, that typically takes a much longer period of time. And our politicians typically live in the very, very shortest of terms because, let's face it, a congressman or woman is elected and then within 1 year they're running for re-election because every 2 years. So they have a very short time horizon and they want to get things done. So they're not usually looking for, if government policy is going to be taking effect, it's going to typically be on demand side. You see very few politicians focused on the supply side, although we do have historically in our political party system, the Republicans tend to be at least overtly more on the supply side, and then the Democrats always on the demand side. In a crisis, they're all pretty much demand side kind of politicians. So that's kind of the distinction we can make in these two ways of thinking about the economy.
All right, well, thank you, and we appreciate your attention here for this episode of No Free Lunch.